There's a video circulating right now claiming that scholars have finally translated a forbidden Sumerian tablet, one that had apparently been hidden, suppressed, or deliberately kept from the public, and that it finally reveals the real reason the gods left Earth. It's a gripping premise. It's also, point by point, almost entirely false, and the way it's false tells you something genuinely interesting about both real Mesopotamian history and the much newer, much stranger modern mythology that's grown up around it. Let's start with the most basic problem. There is no forbidden Sumerian tablet. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system the Sumerians, and later the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, used for roughly 3,000 years, was deciphered by linguists in the middle of the 19th century, largely through painstaking comparative work on a multilingual inscription carved into a cliff face in Iran called the Behistun inscription. Since then, hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets have been excavated, cataloged, and translated by professional Assyriologists and Sumerologists working openly at universities and museums around the world, including the British. Shipping manifests, marriage contracts, and school exercises, where ancient students practiced their handwriting, alongside the much smaller portion of surviving texts that record myths, hymns, and stories about the gods. If there were a single dramatic tablet sitting in a vault somewhere, deliberately withheld from publication for decades, Museum, the Louvre, the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Chicago, where some of the largest cuneiform collections on Earth sit on public display or are available to researchers through published catalogs. None of this material is secret. None of it is suppressed. Most of it is genuinely, almost aggressively unglamorous to read, consisting largely of tax records. Would be one of the strangest cover-ups in the history of academia, requiring the cooperation of thousands of independent researchers across dozens of countries and several generations, all keeping the exact same secret for no clearly stated reason. That's not how archaeology actually works, and it's not how this particular myth works either, once you trace where it actually came from. Where it came from, almost entirely, is a single writer named Zecharia Sitchin, who published a book in 1976 called The 12th Planet, the first in a long series that would eventually be called the Earth Chronicles. Sitchin was not a Sumerologist. He had no formal academic training in Sumerian or Akkadian language, cuneiform script, or Mesopotamian archaeology. He held a degree in economics and worked for years as a journalist and businessman before turning his attention, later in life, to ancient texts that he read largely through existing English translations and his own selective reinterpretations of certain symbols and words. His central claim, the one that has since spread across decades of books, documentaries, and now a constant stream of online videos, was that the Sumerians described contact with an advanced alien species called the Anunnaki, who supposedly traveled to Earth from a planet he called Nibiru, sometimes described as a 10th planet in our solar system on an extremely long elliptical orbit. According to Sitchin, these Anunnaki came seeking gold, used genetic engineering to create modern humans as a labor force to mine that gold, ruled over early civilization as living gods, and eventually departed, leaving behind the scattered, half-remembered myths that later cultures, including the Sumerians themselves, recorded as religious stories about divine beings. It's a compelling narrative, and it's worth being specific about why professional scholars who actually read Sumerian and Akkadian have rejected it almost universally. Because the rejection isn't simply academic gatekeeping or a refusal to consider unconventional ideas. It comes down to translation. The word Anunnaki does appear throughout genuine Sumerian and Akkadian texts, but it isn't the name of a specific alien species. It's better understood as a general term, something closer to princely offspring, or the great gods, used to refer collectively to the senior deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. The way a phrase like the heavenly host gets used in English to refer to angels generally rather than naming one specific group with its own distinct biology and home address. Sitchin's interpretation of the word Nibiru is similarly disputed by actual specialists. In genuine astronomical and mythological cuneiform texts, Nibiru appears as a name associated with the planet Jupiter, or in some contexts with the god Marduk himself, used in a religious and calendrical sense connected to the Babylonian New Year, not as a description of an undiscovered 10th planet with a multi-thousand-year orbit. Sitchin built much of his larger theory on reinterpreting specific cuneiform signs and seal carvings, including a famous Akkadian cylinder seal. He described as depicting our solar system with an extra planet drawn in, an interpretation that professional epigraphers who specialize in reading these seals have examined and rejected, generally identifying the same image as a fairly standard depiction of stars or symbols associated with specific deities, a common and well-documented artistic convention in Mesopotamian seal carving rather than a secret astronomical diagram. None of this means ancient Mesopotamian mythology is boring once you strip away the alien framing. If anything, the real material is stranger, older, and in some ways more emotionally resonant than the version Sitchin and his successors built on top of it, precisely because it was written by people grappling honestly with mortality, divine anger, and the unpredictable, often terrifying relationship between humans and the forces they believed controlled the world. And it just so happens that one of the oldest, most genuine themes running through real Sumerian and Akkadian literature is exactly the one the viral video borrows its hook from: the gods leaving Earth, or more precisely, the gods withdrawing from the world of humans, retreating to the heavens, often in anger, often right before catastrophe. The clearest version of this theme appears in the flood narratives, which exist in multiple overlapping versions across Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian literature, the most complete and best known being the Atrahasis epic, and its later incorporation into the Epic of Gilgamesh. In these stories, humanity is created by the gods, specifically to perform hard labor, originally meant to relieve the lesser gods of the exhausting work of digging canals and maintaining the world. Over time, humans multiply and grow loud, and the god Enlil, often portrayed as a stern, easily provoked authority figure among the divine hierarchy, becomes so irritated by the noise and chaos of human civilization that he resolves to destroy humanity entirely with a flood. Another god, Enki, who in most versions of the myth maintains a closer, more sympathetic relationship with humans, secretly warns a single human, variously named Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, or Ziusudra, depending on which version of the story you're reading, instructing him to build a boat and survive what's coming. Crucially, in several versions of this story, the gods themselves retreat to the heavens before the flood arrives, frightened by the scale of the disaster they've unleashed, watching the destruction from a safe distance, and, in some translations, weeping or expressing regret once they see the devastation actually unfold below them. That's a real, openly translated, frequently studied theme in actual Mesopotamian religious literature. Gods leaving the world of humans, withdrawing to a safer remove precisely at the moment when catastrophe strikes. It's worth sitting with what that theme actually meant to the people who wrote it down, rather than translating it forward into a modern science fiction framework, because the original meaning is genuinely rich on its own terms. For the Sumerians and the later cultures that inherited and adapted their religious literature, the gods withdrawing from direct, intimate contact with humanity wasn't a plot point about a literal departure to outer space. It was a way of explaining something that mattered enormously to people living in an unpredictable agricultural society dependent on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that flooded violently and unpredictably almost every year. Why does the world sometimes turn against us? And why do the gods who supposedly created and cared for us sometimes seem completely, terrifyingly, absent right when we need them most? The myth of divine withdrawal before disaster gave that experience a narrative shape. It wasn't abandonment without reason. It was the gods reacting, sometimes in anger, sometimes in fear, to forces even they couldn't fully control once set in motion. A theological structure that let people make some kind of sense out of disasters that otherwise felt completely arbitrary. It's worth telling the actual decipherment story in a little more detail, because it's a genuinely dramatic piece of real history that gets almost no attention compared to the manufactured drama of the viral version. The Bayastun inscription, carved high into a cliff face in western Iran on the orders of the Persian king Darius the Great, around 2,500 years ago, records the same royal proclamation in 3 different languages and writing systems, side by side: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Cuneiform. In the early 19th century, a British army officer named Henry Rawlinson, stationed in the region, undertook the extraordinarily dangerous task of climbing the cliff face repeatedly over several years to copy down the inscription by hand, dangling from ropes high above the ground to reach sections of the text. Because scholars had already made partial progress deciphering Old Persian, Rawlinson and others were able to use that known language as a key to gradually crack the far more complex cuneiform script. Used for Babylonian, the same basic writing system the Sumerians had originated centuries earlier. It took decades of painstaking collaborative work across multiple European scholars, comparing notes and competing theories, before cuneiform could be read with real confidence. That's the actual origin story behind every translated Sumerian and Akkadian tablet that exists today. Not secrecy, but the opposite. An enormous, multi-decade, fundamentally public collaborative effort by people willing to risk their safety and spend years of their lives solving a puzzle, specifically so that the resulting knowledge could be shared as widely as possible. There is also a related, frequently overlooked text called the Sumerian King List, which records a long lineage of kings supposedly ruling cities across ancient Mesopotamia, beginning with a striking phrase that kingship itself descended from heaven. Early entries on the list describe individual kings ruling for absurdly long reigns, tens of thousands of years in some cases, before the list arrives at the flood, after which rain lengths drop sharply to something resembling ordinary human lifespans. Scholars studying this document generally don't read it as a literal historical record in the modern sense, but as a piece of political and religious literature designed to legitimize the authority of later rulers by tracing an unbroken line of divinely sanctioned kingship all the way back to the earliest mythic age, with the flood serving as a clear dividing line between a semi-divine, mythologized past and the more recognizably human present. That structure, divine or semi-divine beings establishing order on Earth, followed by a catastrophic break, followed by a recognizably human world picking up the pieces, is almost certainly part of where the modern Anunnaki as aliens narrative draws its emotional power. The actual ancient text already contains a story about beings who weren't quite human ruling the early world before everything changed, Sitchinsu. Innovation, if you can call it that, was reinterpreting divine as extraterrestrial, swapping one explanatory framework for a more modern one, while keeping the same basic narrative shape that real Sumerian scribes had already written down thousands of years earlier for entirely different reasons. It's also worth talking honestly about the broader appeal of ancient astronaut theories generally, because that appeal doesn't come from nowhere, and understanding it helps explain why a video like this one keeps finding an audience, no matter how many times its central claims get debunked. Ancient civilizations genuinely did accomplish things that look, from a distance, almost too sophisticated for their tools. Precise astronomical observations recorded in Babylonian texts centuries before equivalent European mathematics caught up, monumental architecture built without modern machinery, written legal codes and literary traditions far more developed than popular imagination often gives credit for. When people first encounter how advanced some of this genuinely was, there's a natural, very human instinct to feel that surprise. Needs a more dramatic explanation than people in the ancient world were exactly as intelligent and capable as people today, working with the tools and accumulated knowledge available to them at the time. Ancient astronaut theories offer that more dramatic explanation, but at a real cost. They tend to quietly diminish the actual achievement of the people who built these civilizations, treating their accomplishments as borrowed from somewhere else rather than earned through generations of accumulated human ingenuity, observation, and effort. The real history, once you actually look at it directly, doesn't need that diminishment. It's already remarkable enough on its own terms. There's also a specific reason the word forbidden does so much work in a headline like this one, beyond simply sounding exciting, and it's worth naming directly. Calling something forbidden implies an authority deliberately keeping it from you, which flatters the viewer with a sense of having gotten past that gatekeeping, of seeing something the institutions supposedly don't want seen. That framing taps into a real and reasonable instinct, since institutions genuinely do sometimes get things wrong or move too slowly, but it gets weaponized here against a field where the actual gatekeeping runs almost entirely in the opposite direction. Professional Assyriology has spent over a century actively trying to get more of this material translated, published, and taught, fighting for research funding, museum access, and public interest in a subject that, frankly, struggles to compete with flashier topics for attention and resources. The actual obstacle facing real Sumerian scholarship isn't suppression. It's the opposite problem. Too few specialists, too many damaged or fragmentary tablets, and not nearly enough public funding to translate everything that's sitting, fully accessible in museum storage rooms around the world, waiting for someone with the right training to finally get around to it. There's a darker thread running through some versions of this same genre, worth naming directly, since the Walmart book description referenced earlier in some versions of this viral cluster invokes it specifically. Claims about ancient nuclear war, radioactive skeletons, and a destroyed advanced civilization, often attributed loosely to Sitchin's broader framework, even when he didn't make that exact claim himself. These claims typically point to genuine archaeological sites in the Middle East and South Asia where skeletal remains or glassy, vitrified surfaces have been found, and assert that elevated radiation readings or unusual glass formations prove some kind of ancient atomic conflict. Actual geologists and archaeologists studying these same sites have generally found far more mundane explanations available: natural background radiation variation, volcanic activity, lightning strikes capable of producing vitrified glass under the right conditions, and ordinary funerary practices that don't require any exotic event to explain. No credible nuclear physicist or archaeologist studying these sites independently has found evidence consistent with an actual ancient nuclear detonation, a technology that, beyond requiring physics far beyond anything in the historical or archaeological record, would also leave extremely specific, well-understood radioactive isotope signatures that modern equipment could detect unambiguously if they existed, the same way modern science can confirm nuclear test sites from the 20th century with total certainty decades after the fact. So if there's no forbidden tablet, no alien Anunnaki, and no ancient nuclear war, what's actually true and worth knowing about how Sumerian translation really works today, since that's the part of the viral claim that at least gestures toward something real. Professional translation of newly discovered or previously unstudied cuneiform tablets is, in fact, an active, ongoing field, just a much slower and far less dramatic one than the viral framing suggests. As one genuine, recent example, a Sumeriologist at the University of Chicago published a complete translation in the last couple of years of a fragmentary tablet that had actually been known to scholars since the 1950s, first noticed and partially studied by the famous Sumerologist Samuel Noah Kramer, but only now fully translated thanks to advances in understanding early Sumerian grammar and vocabulary. The tablet records a previously unknown myth featuring a trickster fox attempting to rescue the storm god Ishkur from the underworld, the kind of story that genuinely had never been read in full before, sitting in a museum collection for decades, openly accessible the entire time, simply waiting for someone with the right specialized expertise to work through its difficult, ambiguous early grammar, carefully enough to produce a confident, complete reading. That's what real, newly translated ancient tablet stories actually look like in practice. Slow, technical, often involving texts that have been physically available the entire time, advancing through patient incremental scholarship rather than secret unveiling. That contrast is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it highlights exactly what the viral video format gets backwards. Real Assyriology moves slowly, because the underlying problem is genuinely difficult. Early Sumerian grammar remains less well understood than the grammar of later periods. Many surviving tablets are damaged, fragmentary, or written in regional dialects and scribal conventions that took decades of comparative work to untangle, and any responsible translation has to account for those ambiguities, honestly, rather than confidently filling gaps with whatever interpretation produces the most dramatic possible story. A viral video promising a freshly translated forbidden tablet skips every one of those difficulties. It doesn't need to show the actual cuneiform. It doesn't need to cite a specific museum catalog number, a specific excavation site, or a specific named scholar willing to defend the translation in an academic journal. It just needs a confident voice and a thumbnail dramatic enough to make the click feel worthwhile. The same pattern that's shown up in every other story examined in this series so far, just transplanted from spacecraft and ocean drones onto 4,000-year-old clay. It's worth being fair, too, about why Sumerian and Akkadian mythology, even stripped of any alien framing, still deserves genuine fascination on its own merits, because the actual material is extraordinary. These are, by a wide margin, among the oldest written stories in human history, predating the Hebrew Bible, the Iliad, and the Odyssey by well over 1,000 years in some cases. The Epic of Gilgamesh alone contains a flood narrative with details, a boat, a search for survivors, birds sent out to find land, that bear an unmistakable resemblance to the much later biblical story of Noah, a connection that mainstream biblical scholars openly study and discuss as part of the shared literary and cultural heritage of the ancient Near East, without needing any alien intervention to explain why two cultures separated by centuries and geography ended up telling structurally similar flood stories, a connection that mainstream biblical scholars openly study and discuss as part of the shared literary and cultural heritage of the ancient Near East, without needing any alien intervention to explain why two cultures separated by centuries and geography ended up telling structurally similar flood stories. It's worth lingering a little longer on the Epic of Gilgamesh specifically, since it's the single text most likely to actually contain the real material being loosely referenced whenever these viral videos talk about gods, floods, and warnings left behind for humanity. Gilgamesh, a king of the city of Uruk, partly based on a possibly real historical ruler, spends much of the epic grappling directly with mortality after watching his closest companion, Enkidu, die. A loss that sends him on a desperate quest to find a way to escape death entirely. That quest eventually leads him to Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, who recounts the entire flood story in detail as part of explaining to Gilgamesh why immortality isn't something humans were ever meant to have. The lesson Utnapishtim offers isn't a warning about returning aliens or hidden technology. It's a meditation on accepting human limitation, built directly into one of the oldest pieces of literature ever recorded, predating Homer by well over 1,000 years. That's the actual message left for humanity, sitting inside this body of literature, available in any modern translation sold in ordinary bookstores. Not a secret about extraterrestrial visitors, but one of the earliest and most direct meditations on mortality that any human civilization ever wrote down. The goddess Inanna's descent into the underworld, where she's stripped of her power and clothing at each gate she passes through before eventually dying and being resurrected, is a genuinely haunting, sophisticated piece of literature exploring themes of power, vulnerability, and mortality that still resonate emotionally today, 4,000 years after it was first composed. None of these stories need to be secretly about extraterrestrial visitors to be worth taking seriously. They're already serious, already strange, and already deeply human in the most literal sense, written by actual people working through actual fears about death, disaster, and the unpredictable relationship between mortals and whatever forces they believed governed their world. There's one more detail worth correcting plainly, since it tends to come up alongside this exact cluster of claims. The notion that ancient Sumerians possessed advanced astronomical knowledge about our solar system that somehow exceeds what their available technology should have allowed, implying outside help. The Sumerians and their successors were, in fact, remarkably skilled astronomers, tracking planetary movements, predicting eclipses with real accuracy over time, and developing a sexagesimal base 60 number system that still survives today in how we divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. But that astronomical sophistication developed the same way most genuine ancient scientific achievement did, through patient, multi-generational naked-eye observation, careful record-keeping passed down through scribal schools over centuries, and a culture that placed enormous religious and practical importance on tracking the sky accurately for calendar and agricultural purposes. That same base 60 counting system, incidentally, is part of why later Babylonian astronomers were able to predict lunar eclipses and planetary positions with a precision that genuinely impressed Greek astronomers centuries afterward, who openly credited Babylonian observational records as a foundation for their own work, a documented chain of influence running from real Mesopotamian scholars through to the later Western scientific tradition, with no unexplained gap anywhere in it that would require an outside visitor to fill. None of the genuine astronomical records require knowledge of an undiscovered planet, an advanced alien visitor, or any technology beyond careful eyes, patient record-keeping, and a very long span of accumulated cultural memory. That's not a disappointing answer. It's arguably a more impressive one because it means an enormous amount of real, hard-won human intellectual achievement is sitting underneath this story. Achievement that gets quietly erased every time someone reframes it as something borrowed from elsewhere rather than built, slowly and carefully, by actual people living in the actual ancient world. So where does that leave the original claim, the forbidden tablet finally translated, revealing why the gods left Earth? The honest answer is that the premise collapses at every single point you can actually check. There's no forbidden tablet, because Sumerian and Akkadian texts have been openly translated and published for well over a century by named scholars working at name Oastanwa. Institutions? With their methods and disagreements published openly in academic journals, anyone can access. The Anunnaki were never a specific alien species in the genuine ancient texts. They were a general term for the senior gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon. The idea that the gods withdrew from Earth is real, openly documented, and genuinely ancient, but it appears in flood. Narratives written to explain divine anger and human mortality, not extraterrestrial departure. And the broader Anunnaki as aliens framework traces back overwhelmingly to one 20th century writer without formal training in the relevant ancient languages, whose specific translations of key terms have been examined and rejected by virtually every credentialed Sumerologist and Assyriologist who has engaged with them directly and publicly. None of that rejection required suppressing anything. It simply required sitting down with the actual cuneiform, the actual grammar, and the actual archaeological context, and checking the claim the same patient way every other claim in this field gets checked. What's left, once you clear all of that away, is something that doesn't need any invented mystery to justify your attention. A genuinely ancient, genuinely strange, genuinely moving body of literature written by real people in real cities along 2 real rivers, grappling honestly with floods they couldn't control, gods they couldn't fully trust, and a mortality they couldn't escape using stories. Sophisticated enough that fragments of them survived in modified form into texts people still read and take seriously today. Real Sumerologists are still working through that literature carefully, tablet by tablet, dialect by dialect, occasionally producing a genuinely new, complete translation of something nobody had fully understood before, the way the fox and the storm god myth finally came together after 70 years of partial scholarship. That's slower than a viral video promising a forbidden secret. It's also, once you actually sit with it, considerably more interesting, because every detail in it is real, checkable, and earned through the patient work of people willing to spend their entire careers learning to read a language nobody has spoken aloud in 4,000 years, simply because the stories underneath it were worth the effort of finally getting them right.